I spent the morning going back through exactly what happened in Berlin yesterday. The E5 met. Britain, France, Italy, Poland, Germany, all in one room. And the more I read about the silence that came out of it, the clearer it got that this wasn't a routine check-in. Let me walk you through it. Before I keep going, I'm curious where you land on this one. Drop a comment and tell me what you make of it. Because honestly, I went back and forth myself trying to figure out if this was good news or something else entirely. So, there's a part of this Berlin meeting that didn't make the headlines. And I want to explain it to you because on the surface, it sounds like a pretty standard diplomatic get-together. 5 European leaders, Germany's capital, talks about the Russia-Ukraine war, a summit planned for July. Standard, except it's not standard. It's actually the opposite of standard. And if you blinked, you probably missed why. Let me take you back to what happened. The E5, that's Britain, France, Italy, Poland, and Germany. 5 of the most powerful nations in Europe. They gathered in Berlin. Al Jazeera broke the report. The talks were held ahead of a larger summit that's scheduled for July. That's all we know. That's the official line. No specifics on outcomes, no agreements disclosed, nothing on what they actually decided. And that silence right there, that's the thing that gets me. Because these aren't 5 leaders meeting to chat about the weather. They're meeting to coordinate on a war that's been grinding on for years now. A war that has reshaped global energy. A war that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives. A war that has redrawn the map of European security. And they met in secret. Well, not secret exactly. They let the cameras catch the arrivals. They let the press know they were in the building. But what they talked about, nothing. Now ask yourself this. Why would 5 of the most powerful leaders on the planet hold a meeting about the biggest war in Europe since 1945 and then say nothing about what came out of it? Snorts, look, I've been doing this long enough to know that when the official readout is that empty, it's because the real conversation was about something else, something they're not ready to tell the public yet. And I think I know what it was. But before I get there, we need to rewind a little because this didn't start in Berlin. This has been building for months, years even. Remember the early days of the war when the whole world seemed united, when everyone was on the same page about what Russia was doing and what had to be done about it? That unity, it's not what it used to be. There's been a slow creeping fatigue in Europe, a kind of war weariness that you can feel in the statements, in the polling, in the way leaders talk about aid packages. They're tired. Their populations are tired. They're looking at their own economies, their own energy prices, their own elections, and they're asking the same question over and over again. How long can we keep this up? That's the question nobody wanted to ask out loud, but it's been there underneath everything. And what's been happening in Washington hasn't exactly helped. The American political scene has been chaotic. There's been a war of words between the White House and Congress. Funding for Ukraine has turned into a political football. Every few months, there's a new fight, a new delay, a new reason to wonder whether the U.S. is still all in. Europe has watched this every single time, and they've had to calculate what happens if the U.S. pulls back, if the support gets cut, if they have to do this alone. That's a terrifying calculation to make. So they started talking among themselves quietly. At first, it was just informal conversations, side meetings at other summits, chats over dinner, nothing official. Nothing you could point to and say, there it is, they're making a move. But it was happening. And then came Berlin. Here's what I think went down in that room. And I want to be clear, I'm piecing this together from what they didn't say, from the patterns, from the timing, because when you've been watching these people long enough, you start to understand their language, the language of omission. The E5 is a specific group. It's not NATO. It's not the U. It's a smaller, tighter circle. The big players, the ones who would have to carry the weight if the U.S. ever stepped back. They met in Berlin to figure out what happens in July at that bigger summit, the one that's coming up. And here's the part that really gets me, the part I haven't seen anyone explain properly. This isn't about coordination on the war, not in the way you think, because coordination is easy. They've been coordinating for years. They've got channels, they've got established procedures. They don't need a secret meeting in Berlin just to say we're still coordinating. No, this was about something else. This was about the end game. Let me explain what I mean by that. The war in Ukraine has reached a kind of stalemate. It's grinding. It's brutal. Russia has taken territory, but not as much as they wanted. Ukraine has held, but not as much as they hoped. Both sides are bleeding. Both sides are running low on, well, everything. People, equipment, patience. And in that kind of stalemate, the question changes. It stops being how do us win and starts being how do we stop. And that's where Berlin comes in. Because the E5, they're not just coordinating on weapon shipments. They're coordinating on what comes after, on the off-ramps, on the levers they can pull to bring both sides to a table. But here's the problem, and it's a big one. Russia doesn't want to come to the table. Not on terms that anyone in that room would accept. Putin has made that pretty clear. He wants what he wants, and what he wants is control over Ukrainian territory. So if you're sitting in Berlin and you're looking at a war that can't be won militarily and can't be ended diplomatically, what do you do? That's the question they were grappling with. And I think they were trying to figure out what they're willing to give up. Not publicly, not officially, but in their own minds, in their own calculus, what are they willing to sacrifice to make this end? Because that's the ugly truth nobody wants to say out loud. War is about choices, and sometimes the choices are all bad. Now imagine you're the British Prime Minister or the French President or the German Chancellor. You've got a war in your backyard. You've got citizens who are struggling with inflation. You've got elections coming up. You've got 1,000 different pressures. And you've got a partner across the Atlantic who might not be reliable forever. That's the nightmare scenario they're preparing for. That's what Berlin was really about. And I'll tell you why that matters to you. Because the U.S. is part of this. Not directly in the room in Berlin, maybe, but in every single thought those leaders had, they were thinking about Washington. They were thinking about what the American response would be to whatever they decide. And here's where it gets really interesting. The July summit, they're already laying the groundwork for it. Berlin was the first step. The private conversation, the one where they could speak freely without the cameras rolling. And the fact that they kept it so quiet, the fact that we have almost nothing on what was actually said, tells me they don't want us to know yet. They're not ready to tell the public what they're planning. And that should make you nervous, because when leaders plan things in private, it usually means one of two things. Either they're working on something good that they want to surprise everyone with, or they're working on something that they know people won't like. And given the track record of this war, I have to lean toward the second one. Snorts, let me break it down for you step by step, because I want you to understand what's at stake here. Right now, there's a narrative out there that everything is fine, that the Western alliance is strong, that the war is under control. But that narrative is paper thin, and Berlin just poked a hole in it. Because if everything was fine, they wouldn't need a secret meeting. They wouldn't need to huddle in Berlin and talk behind closed doors. They just do their normal coordination calls and release a normal statement. They didn't do that. They did this. And that tells me they're worried. They're worried enough to break from the normal playbook. They're worried enough to have a conversation that they don't want us to hear. And what are they worried about? I think they're worried about the U.S., about how much longer the commitment will hold, about what happens if there's another election that changes the foreign policy direction, about whether they can count on America the way they used to. That's a heavy thought for a European leader. A terrifying one. For 70 years, the U.S. has been the anchor of European security, the guarantor of peace, the one who could be counted on when things got tough. And now they're not so sure. So they're building a backup plan, a plan B, a way to keep the war going or to end it without depending entirely on Washington. That's what Berlin was about. That's what the July summit will be about. And that plan B, it might look a lot different from what you expect. Let me walk you through what a plan B could involve. Option one, they decide to double down. They commit more resources. They try to push Russia back militarily. That would be the aggressive option, the one that says we're not backing down no matter what. But that's expensive, politically expensive, economically expensive, and there's no guarantee it works. Option two, they start looking for a negotiated settlement, a way to freeze the conflict, a deal that gives Russia some of what it wants in exchange for a ceasefire. That's the pragmatic option, the one that ends the fighting. But it also means abandoning parts of Ukraine. It means accepting that Russia gets to keep territory. It means a partial victory for Putin. And that's the one that keeps me up at night. Because when you read the tea leaves from Berlin, when you look at the secrecy, the timing, the makeup of the group, it starts to look like option two is the direction they're heading. They're not going to say it out loud. Not yet. They'll dress it up in diplomatic language. They'll talk about de-escalation and political solutions. But underneath all that, it's a retreat. And that's the detail that nobody's explaining properly. Now let me talk about the reactions because they're telling. Ukraine wasn't in the room. They weren't invited. And that's a choice, a very deliberate choice. You would think that a war being fought on Ukrainian soil would involve Ukrainian representatives, that the people whose country is being destroyed would have a seat at the table. But they didn't. They were left out. And that sends a message, a loud one. The E5 is making decisions about Ukraine's future without Ukraine. Now that might be because they want to protect Ukraine from the hard conversations, or it might be because they're planning something Ukraine wouldn't agree to. I think you know which one I'm leaning toward. Poland was in the room. That's important. Poland has been one of the most hawkish voices in Europe. They've been deeply skeptical of any compromise with Russia. They have their own history with Moscow, their own trauma. So if Poland was in that room, and if they walked out without saying anything, that's significant. That means they either got what they wanted or they got outvoted. And I don't think they got what they wanted. Because Poland has been publicly pushing for more military support, more pressure on Russia. They're not the ones looking for a way out. They're the ones looking to win. If Poland had won the argument in Berlin, we would know about it. There would have been a statement, a clear show of strength. There wasn't. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the other four, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, they moved towards something else, something Poland didn't like, and that something is probably a softer line on Russia. I want you to really sit with that for a minute, because for years, the West has presented a united front. All in, no concessions, Russia must lose. And now, behind closed doors, the unity is cracking, not with a bang, with a whisper. A meeting in Berlin, a statement that says nothing. This is how big shifts happen, not all at once, slowly in pieces that look like nothing on their own. But when you put them together, the picture is unmistakable. Now let me bring it closer to home to you, because if the E5 is moving toward a negotiated settlement, toward freezing the conflict, toward giving Russia some of what it wants, that has consequences for America. And those consequences are big. First, it means the U.S. is going to be put in an awkward position. If Europe starts pushing for a ceasefire and the U.S. isn't ready for one, that's a transatlantic crisis, a break in the relationship. Second, it means Ukraine is going to feel betrayed, abandoned. They've been fighting for years. They've lost thousands of people, and now the allies they counted on are cutting a deal without them. Third, and this is the big one, it changes the global balance of power. If Russia gets to keep Ukrainian territory, it sends a message to every other authoritarian regime out there that aggression pays, that if you're willing to endure the costs, you can take what you want. And that's a message that China, Iran, North Korea, they're all watching. Every single one of them. So the stakes in Berlin, they weren't just about a war in Eastern Europe. They were about the future of the international order, about whether the rules that have kept the world relatively stable since World War II, whether those rules still hold. And I think the answer coming out of that room, the one they didn't put in the statement, is that they don't hold. Not like they used to. Let me go back to the timing for a second. The July summit. The E5 met in Berlin to prep for that summit, which means the big conversations are coming, the ones that will actually shape policy. We're talking about a few months. That's the timeline. Over the next few months, the leaders of the free world are going to decide how this war ends. And they're going to do it in rooms like that one in Berlin, quiet rooms with no cameras. And they're going to decide a lot of things that we won't know about until it's too late. Now ask yourself, do you trust them to get it right? Because I don't. I don't trust them because I've watched them for years. I've watched them make one mistake after another. I've watched them put their own political survival ahead of the people dying in a frozen field in eastern Ukraine. They're human. They're flawed. They're scared. And scared people make bad decisions. So, what do we do about it? What can we do? Well, the first step is to pay attention to not let these quiet meetings fade into the background noise of the news cycle, to ask the questions that they don't want us to ask, what was said in that room, what was agreed, who won the argument, and who lost. Those are the questions that matter. And the fact that we don't have answers, that's not an accident. That's by design. Here's what I think, and I want you to remember this. I think the E5 is going to come out of that July summit with a new position, a shift toward de-escalation, toward a frozen conflict, toward accepting that Ukraine can't win, and that the best they can hope for is a pause. I think they're going to call it, quote, peace. But it's not peace, it's a ceasefire. And a ceasefire without a clear victory. That's just a chance for Russia to regroup, to rearm, and to try again. We've seen this movie before in Georgia, in Crimea, in Donbass. Every time Russia gets a pause, they come back harder. They learn from the mistakes, they adapt. And the West, we adapt too. We adapt by lowering our expectations, by getting used to a new normal, by forgetting that we used to think something else was normal. I'm telling you right now, if the E5 pushes for a settlement that leaves Russia in control of Ukrainian territory, that's not the end of the war. That's just the end of this chapter. And Putin knows it. He's watching. He's waiting. He's looking at that room in Berlin and calculating what he can get away with. That's the real danger, not the war itself, the precedent it sets. Because if Russia can invade its neighbor, kill tens of thousands of people, destroy entire cities, and end up with more territory than it started with, what stops the next dictator from doing the same thing? Nothing. And that's the world we're walking into. The world that the E5 is preparing for in those quiet rooms. The world where might makes right, where the strong take what they want and the weak just have to accept it. That's not a world I want to live in. And I don't think you do either. So here's where I land on all of this. The Berlin meeting was a warning, a quiet one, a subtle one, but a warning nonetheless. The alliance is fraying, the commitment is wavering, and the people who are supposed to be leading us through this, they're not sure what to do. And that uncertainty, that fear, it's going to drive them toward a bad decision. The decision to cut a deal, to give up, to let Russia take what it wants in exchange for a few years of quiet. And when that decision is made, it'll be made in private, not in front of the cameras, not with a big press conference, just a statement, a vague one, a lot like the one that came out of Berlin. Nothing specific, nothing to grab onto, just enough to let you know that something happened. But if you're paying attention, you'll know what it means. You'll know that a new world is being born, a darker one, a more dangerous one. And you'll know that the people who could have stopped it, they were sitting in a room in Berlin trying to figure out how to get themselves out of a mess they helped create. So, I'll leave you with this. The next few months are going to be crucial. The July summit is going to be one of the most important meetings since the end of the Cold War, maybe since World War II. And what comes out of it will shape the world for decades. Watch the statements. Watch the language. Watch for what's not said, for the silences, for the details that get buried in the back of the press releases, because that's where the truth is. That's where they're hiding it. And if you're not paying attention, you're going to miss the moment when everything changes. That's the report from Berlin. That's what I think happened. Now, I'm curious what you think, because honestly, I don't have all the answers. I'm still working through it myself. But I know this, the quiet ones are the ones that get you. The loud headlines, the big announcements, those are easy to see. They're designed to be seen. But the quiet meetings, the ones with no statement, those are the ones that actually matter. This isn't over, not by a long shot. And I'll be here watching, asking the questions, trying to figure out what's really going on. I hope you'll stick around for it, because if we're going to get through this, we need to do it together. Paying attention, asking the right questions, holding them accountable, and that's the whole point of this channel. That's why we're here. We'll keep watching and we'll keep talking. And when the news does break, the real news will be ready for it.